So you're in your house just sitting by a window, right? Nothing special because it's just a normal day, and you see a bird. Let's say it's a crow, and you don't think twice about it because after all, it's just a bird. It's got feathers, no big deal. Then later that same day, you see a squirrel, and you think, that squirrel has fur, that bird has feathers, and then you move on with your life because you're a normal person and you don't obsess over these things. But me, I'm not so normal. I think about these things a lot, right? Now I want you to hear me out for a minute because birds and mammals share a common ancestor. Way back, somewhere around 320 million years ago, there was this little reptile-like creature running around in the swamp, and that creature had descendants, and some of those descendants went one direction and became mammals, and some went another direction and became reptiles and eventually birds. Now, I hope you can all see where I'm going with this, because if we all started from the same place, why did one branch end up with fur and the other ended up with feathers? Like, what was the moment where evolution was like, you know what, you guys can get hair and you weirdos over there can get feathers? Doesn't that seem like a good question to think about? I mean, why? Why did it turn out that way? Well, I've done some digging, and to answer that, we have to go back, and I mean way back, not just to the dinosaurs, but further. We have to go back to the very first time skin decided it wanted to get creative. Now, if I'm being honest, skin is boring, right? It's just this stretchy stuff that holds our insides in. But skin is actually one of the most important organs that we never really think about, because for most of its evolutionary history, skin was just this simple thing. It was either smooth or covered in scales. And scales are fine, don't get me wrong. They're tough, they're protective, and they stop you from drying out like a raisin in the sun. I mean, fish have scales, reptiles have scales, heck, even dinosaurs had scales. But scales have one big problem. They're terrible at keeping you warm because they're basically just armor. And armor is useful, but again, it's not exactly something that can keep you warm. So somewhere along the line, evolution started tinkering with this whole armor design. And this is where I got to bring it back to the common ancestor I mentioned earlier. Yeah, it was an amniote, which means it laid eggs on land. And that creature had a certain set of genetics. Those genetics included the ability to make keratin, which I feel like you all know this already, but it's the protein that makes hair, nails, scales, and feathers. Now, keratin is like Lego bricks. You can build anything with it if you have the right set of instructions. And as you can probably guess, because I wouldn't be making this video, both the mammal lineage and the reptile lineage inherited those same Lego bricks, but they got different instructions. Now, with both lineages getting different instructions, this is where the great split in the lineage happens, because one group, known as the Synapsids, heads off and eventually becomes mammals. That's us, by the way. The other group, known as the Diapsids, heads off and becomes reptiles, dinosaurs, and eventually birds. And for the longest time, both groups were just scaly, because scales were the default setting. Scales are cheap, they're easy to make, and they work well enough. I mean, after all, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Well, here's the thing. Things actually started breaking. The planet started going through some climate chaos. Temperatures were all over the place, and if you're a small creature trying to survive, being scaly is a problem, because you're basically at the mercy of the environment. Because while scales can keep you cool, it's not something that you can use to regulate your body temperature to a certain extent. So that means when it's cold, you get cold. When it's hot, you get the point. So because of this problem, both lineages started experimenting with ways to trap heat. The mammals, also known as Synapsids, started growing thin, flexible strands of keratin between their scales. These strands trapped a layer of air next to the skin, which kept the heat in. And over millions of years, those strands got denser and denser, and the scales started disappearing, until eventually you had a continuous coat of hair. That's what we would call fur. It's simple, it's effective, and it comes with some nice bonuses. It can stand on end to make you look bigger, it can change color, and it can sense the world around you. But over on the other side of the family tree, the Diapsids were cooking up something completely different. Now, even though they also started experimenting with keratin strands poking out between their scales, the difference in theirs is that it started to branch. Instead of one little hair, they grew a filament that split into multiple strands. Then those strands then split again, and eventually, after millions of years, they ended up with something less like fur and more like a tiny, complicated bush growing out of their skin. These are what you would call proto-feathers, and they're basically the ancestors of feathers. Now here's the part that blew my mind when I first learned about it, and I need you to really sit with this for a second because it's the key to everything. These proto-feathers were not for flying. Flight hadn't been invented yet. There were no birds, there were no wings, there was just fuzzy dinosaurs running around on the ground, looking like angry little chickens that got lost on their way to Easter. And they were fuzzy for the same reason mammals were furry: insulation. That's it. That's the whole reason feathers exist in the first place. Flight came later as a complete accident, a happy byproduct, like how microwave ovens were invented because some guy noticed a candy bar melting in his pocket. So now we have two lineages, both starting from the same place, both trying to solve the same problem, and they come up with two completely different solutions. Mammals go with the simple, dense mat, and dinosaurs go with the complex branching structure. And once you commit to one path, you can't go back, because that's how evolution works, so you have to keep refining that design for the next 200 million years. Now, let's kind of hone in and talk about those fuzzy dinosaurs, because this is where the story gets really good. You see, for the longest time, we had no idea that dinosaurs had feathers. Every reconstruction that was done showed them as these scaly, lizardy monsters. And that made sense because we'd found dinosaur skin impressions, and they showed scales. But then, in the 1990s, everything changed when farmers in northeastern China, in a region called the Jehol biota, started digging up fossils that were so perfectly preserved you could actually see the individual feathers. Now, these weren't just any dinosaurs. These were small, meat-eating dinosaurs from the group called theropods, the same group that includes the T-Rex and Velociraptor, the ones that Hollywood makes movies about. Now, the first big discovery was a dinosaur called Sinosauropteryx. This thing was about the size of a turkey, and it was covered in a fuzzy coat. Not complex feathers with veins and barbs, just simple, hollow filaments running down its back and tail. Now, Sinosauropteryx couldn't fly, it ran on the ground, so those filaments had to be for something else, right? Well, insulation was the obvious answer, but then scientists looked closer, and they found something even cooler. What they found were melanosomes. If you don't know what those are, they're tiny structures that contain pigment. The reason why this discovery was cool is because by studying the shape of the melanosomes, they could actually figure out what color the filaments were. And it turns out that Sinosauropteryx had a reddish-brown coat with a striped tail. It was literally a ginger dinosaur just showing off. And that's the second piece of the entire puzzle, because once you have these filaments, you can start using them for display, meaning that if you tweak them enough, you can make them brighter, you can make them longer, and you can make them weird. And that's exactly what happened, because other dinosaurs from the same region, like the Caudipteryx and Bapiosaurus, had more complex feathers, like modern bird feathers, but they still couldn't fly. They were using them for display, maybe for balance, or maybe just for covering their nests. The point I'm trying to make is that feathers were becoming multitaskers because they weren't just used for insulation anymore. Now this is where we gotta zoom in, because we've talked about the what and the why, but we haven't talked about the how. Like, how do you go from a simple hollow filament to a feather that can support flight? Well, the answer is genetics, and I can tell you right now that it's more fascinating than any dinosaur fossil, because it turns out that the instructions for building a feather are buried deep inside the DNA of all reptiles, including birds and crocodiles. Seriously, crocodiles have the genes to make feathers, they just never turn them on. So what flips the switch? How do you turn this gene on? Well, scientists have been studying this for decades, and they've identified a few key players. One of them is a gene called Sonic Hedgehog. Yes, named after the video game character. And no, I'm not joking. I'm being dead serious. That's actually what it's called. It's called that because if you mess with it, the embryos grow all spiky and messed up, like a hedgehog. Now, Sonic Hedgehog is what's called a signaling pathway, meaning it's a chemical messenger that tells cells what to do. In a developing feather, sonic hedgehog is active at the very tip of the growing filament. It tells the cells to keep dividing, to keep branching out. So that means if you block sonic hedgehog, the feather stops growing. And that's exactly what a team at the University of Geneva did in 2025 when they took chicken embryos and temporarily blocked sonic hedgehog at the exact moment feathers were starting to form. And what ended up happening is that the embryos grew simple, unbranched filaments. They grew proto-feathers, meaning they essentially reverted back into a dinosaur-like state. Now, this experiment was actually pretty big because it proved that the difference between a fuzzy dinosaur and a modern bird is just a matter of timing and signaling. If you flip one switch, you get fluff. If you flip it back, you get flight feathers. But it's not just one gene, it's multiple genes working together. There's a gene called beta-catenin, which tells skin cells to start forming a feather in the first place. There's a family of genes called bone morphogenetic proteins, or BMPs for short, which sculpt the shape of the feather. And there are even genes that control color, growth rate, and symmetry. Now, many of these same genes are active in mammals when they grow hair. We have the same basic toolkit, but we just used it differently. So fur and feathers are kind of like cousins because they're related. They come from the same ancestral family, but they went their separate ways and developed their own personalities. Now, let's talk about the feather itself, because once you understand what a feather actually is, you'll probably never look at one the same way again. Now, the simplest way I can describe a feather is that it isn't a single object, it's a structure. Because if you start at the base, you've got the quill. That's the hollow part that sticks into the skin. Above that is the rachis, which is the central shaft, and coming off the rachis are hundreds of barbs, which are like little branches, and on each barb there are even smaller branches called barbules. And this is where evolution decided to get really creative, because the barbules on one barb have tiny hooks, and the barbules on the next barb have tiny grooves. What happens is that the hooks latch onto the grooves and zip all the barbs together into a smooth, continuous surface. It's Velcro. Well, it's nature's Velcro that was invented 150 million years before humans ever thought of it. Now, because the feather is made of keratin, it's strong, it's lightweight, and it can be molded into any shape. You want a feather that's stiff enough for flying? You make the rachis thick and the barbs tightly zipped. You want a fluffy feather for insulation? You leave the barbs unzipped so they trap air. You want a display feather for attracting a mate? You make it long and colorful. Every single one of those variations is the same branching keratin filaments. So let's bring it back to the original question. Why do birds have feathers instead of fur? Well, the simple answer is because the bastards got stuck with them. Their ancestors invested millions of years into perfecting it. They used it for insulation, for display, for camouflage, and for communication. And when some of those dinosaurs started experimenting with flight, they already had the tool equipped. It just needed to be tweaked a bit, whether it was by making some feathers bigger, asymmetrical, or by rearranging them. Again, the tool for flight was already there. It was just waiting to be repurposed. Mammals, on the other hand, went down a different path. We invested in hair, and hair is great, don't get me wrong. And again, it's great for insulation, it's great for sensing, it can stand on end to make you look bigger, and it can change color. But hair has a problem because it can't form a solid surface, meaning you can't fly with hair because air just passes right through it, and you can't use your hair to make elaborate displays like a peacock's train. But then again, we humans have created some pretty ridiculous hairstyles, so don't quote me on that last one. But anyway, back to what I was saying. That's why birds are the way they are. They're not just animals with feathers, they're the endpoint of a 200 million year experiment in material science. They are indeed living fossils, carrying the genetic memory of fuzzy dinosaurs. So the next time you see a pigeon on the sidewalk, don't just see a bird. I want you to see the millions of years of evolution that it took to get to this point. See a creature that shows complexity over simplicity. And maybe, just maybe, feel a little jealous because your store-bought jacket is probably sitting in a closet somewhere. That pigeon is wearing the best all-in-one garment in the world because it's warm, waterproof, aerodynamic, and it's been in development longer than any fashion line in history. Plus, it doesn't need dry cleaning.